we at Brightbeam have set out to tell the story of how white women as mothers and as teachers have historically used their positions of power to perpetuate systems of oppression, and how that history remains alive and active today.
And right now what we're doing in the schools is we're letting parents, evangelical Christians, come in and tell us what we have to do in the schools. Oh, no, 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 no. We cannot, for years we couldn't have, we had to have separation of church and state. And then the people in the Knights of Columbus lobbied their congressmen to get the president to put the words "under God" into the pledge. Under God, indivisible. Under God, just before the word indivisible. That automatically divides us into people who believe and who don't believe in God. We put the words "under God" in just before the word "indivisible." It is oxymoronic thinking, and people don't realize that. They just stand there, put their hands over their hearts, and say that crap like it made any sense at all, and it doesn't. Those words don't belong there. We have the words "in God we trust" on our money, on our paper money. In God we trust. Underneath it, it should say, "all others pay cash." Yeah, we need to take the words "under God" out of the pledge. And I told my third graders, because I had children whose parents didn't believe in praying publicly. I said, if you kids don't want to say the words "under God" in the pledge, you don't have to. And if you want to, you can sit down during the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag as long as the words "under God" are in it. And a couple of them sat down every year. And I had no problem with that because I didn't have the right to force my religion or somebody else's religion on every one of those kids.
Right.
It's against the law.
Right. I taught government for many years, and I, amongst the other social studies, and when kids would rile up and say they didn't want to stand, and I said, that is your right. You have, I said, the flag represents your right to not pledge the flag.
No.
So, have a seat then. Just don't disrupt the others who want to do that.
That's right.
And, speaking of the evangelicals and the trouble that's been stirring recently, education's been a hot topic in elections, and we've seen a lot of things happening in this, nonsense in school board meetings across the country. We've seen book bans. We've seen educational gag orders where teachers are being told what they can and cannot talk about in their classroom, even if it's true.
The reason we have that is because, you see, I was born in 1933, the year that Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt came to power in their respective countries. So from 1933 till 1945, I heard my father just ranting and raving about what Adolf Hitler was doing and what the people in Germany were being subjected to and what he was trying to do worldwide. So when this person came, our T. Rump came, I immediately thought, my God, he sounds Hitlerian. And then I told myself, you're exaggerating. Come on, Jane, this is ridiculous. This isn't happening. And then I read the book, When at Times the Mob is Swayed. Have you read it?
I haven't.
Most people have never heard of it. Get the book, When at Times the Mob is Swayed. And in the first chapter, the man who wrote the book says, in his bedside table in a locked drawer, the former president of the United States has the book, The New World Order, which contains the writings of Adolf Hitler. Now, when you think this is Hitlerian, you read that book, When at Times the Mob is Swayed, and then you will realize that I'm not just dreaming this. I'm not exaggerating. This is exactly what is happening. He has used, and is still using as his ideas for governing what he learned from Adolf Hitler. And most young people today, kids in high schools today, kids in the schools in which you taught, didn't spend a lot of time on the Second World War because there were other things that were happening that we had to talk about too. But the most damaging 10 years, 15 years in this country were the years when Adolf Hitler was being allowed to do the things that he was doing in Germany. We have to realize that if we allow that to happen someplace else and we still do business with the country that's allowing that to happen, eventually it will happen here. We could make a big difference. You as a social studies teacher could make a big difference if you'd say to your students, this is not America. Every citizen who lives in any country from the northernmost point of Canada to the southernmost point of South America lives in America. North America, Central America, South America. We're all Americans, but those of us in the United States of America, in that 48 contiguous states, Alaska, Hawaii, and the islands off the southeastern coast of the United States, we are the United States of Americans. And we've got to start calling this country either the United States, or if you don't want to use all those syllables, the U.S., because U.S. spells us. We've got to be more careful with our language. The United States of America is a separate place, and that's what we deserve. We deserve to call this country united. The most important word in that title is the word united. And we leave it out. We shouldn't. We've got to put it back in.
Now we've seen like we've seen the book bans, we've seen the backlash. People are trying to teach the truth in things like the 1619 Project.
Well, wait a minute. Let's deal with the 1619 Project. We teach the 1619 Project because that's when we went to England, to the town of Hull, and bought a bunch of human beings whom the British brought from Africa to bring here to sell to us for the slave trade. That's when we study black people? No, we should be studying black people from 10,000 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
But teachers will say, well, that's prehistorical. No, people, that is the truth. We need to teach the truth. The first black people who came here were not brought here as slaves. They came here as discoverers and explorers 10,000, between 20,000 and 10,000 years before Columbus was born. Let's teach the truth about blackness instead of saying, this is what's important, is the year we brought them here as slaves. For the love of God.
Oh, so with all these things happening, whether we're talking about, the 1619 Project or CRT or book banning or even book burning or firing teachers.
Wait a minute. You said the magic word, CRT, critical race theory, which is another way of saying bullshit. I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous. For me, CRT stands for Curriculum Respecting Truth. What other kind of education should we be offering other than a curriculum that respects the truth, that tells us that the first discoverers of the United States of America came from Africa? People we call Indians were not Indians, and they did not come up out of the ground. They came from Africa, just like all the rest of us did. So go on. Go past CRT now to something else.
Okay. No, I think that what you're talking about, though, like curriculum that respects the truth, is right in line with a lot of what people are trying to say when they're talking about that kind of critical education, where you dig in and you say, like, this is what's really happening. We have to look at the truth. We have to look at what's really happening instead of the romanticized narratives.
But if you call it a theory instead of a fact, it's just something you think might be true. It's a fact.
Right. Oh, okay.
Truth is a fact. We've got to get rid of the word theory, and we've got to get rid of the word critical. Because it sounds like this is something that is debatable. No! The fact that we all came from Africa is not something you can debate any longer. I'll never forget a couple of young Japanese women. I had an argument with them at my daughter's house here in California a couple of years ago. And this woman said, we didn't come from Africa. We came from Peking man. I said, well, I'm sorry, but Homo sapiens outnumbered Peking man and all the rest of those humanoids. And what we are all Homo sapiens at heart. Someplace you have some gene from Africa. Well, I don't think I said, okay, go home. I'm not going to argue about this with you because I was 3 times as old as she was. I'm 3 times as old as anybody. I've lived through a third of the history of the United States. So I was going to argue with her. I said, go home and look it up. So she wrote to me 2 weeks later. She got a letter from her. And she said, I found out, Mrs. Elliott, that you were right. My ancestors were some of the first Afro-Asians that came to Japan. But now we have instant communication. We can learn things that you never could learn before. And if you want to know and you want to stop being a racist, you indulge in a little self-education. If you want to stop being a racist, you cannot expect a school and the teachers to help you to stop being a racist, because right now they're in trouble if they even say the word race. So we're going to punish teachers who tell the truth. So what teachers have to do is say quietly to the boys and girls when nobody's watching, there's a book over in the library. Get it. It's about what this country was like before we messed it up. Don't tell anybody I told you, but if you want to learn the truth, there's a book over there in the library. Those books should be in the library. And every teacher should be willing to say to Johnny or Marilyn or Omar, try this book. I can't teach about this, but you can learn about this all by yourself. And nobody can tell you not to learn as long as you choose to learn this all by yourself. Nobody can criticize me for doing it or you for learning it. But it's absolutely essential that you know the truth.
So now that's a great segue into a question that I've been very curious about this week. Last week when we spoke, we talked a little bit about something happening in your home community with the schools, and the teachers were in trouble. Could you tell me a little bit more about what happened there? There's some teachers that were in danger of being fired, along the lines of
my daughter called the superintendent. They blew it out of proportion, and the superintendent quietly handled it. And if superintendents at every level would say, look, and this is what my superintendent did. I had 3 different superintendents and 3 different principals while I was teaching. Every one of them got just pilloried because they kept Jane Elliott in the classroom. They kept me hired. And every time they'd come and complain, people would come and complain about Mrs. Elliott, the superintendent would say to them, she is hired to teach children. I am hired to hire and fire teachers. I have hired her and I will not fire her. And she will be here as long as she chooses to keep on teaching because she does a good job of what she is hired to do. He had to do that every year, several times every year. And I'll never forget the parent who called and said to the principal, I don't want my kid in that N-word lover's classroom, but I want him to learn to read, so put him in there anyway. And I taught him to read, but I also taught him, don't use the N-word, not in my presence, and not on the bus, and not on the school ground, because this is public property. That's against the law. That is discriminatory behavior, and it will not be allowed. And if I hear you using it, I will make you suffer. You don't like being in the classroom with me during the day? You act that way and you'll be with me after school, just the 2 of us. Slow down the learning and you'll have to come back after school and you will learn with me all alone, just the 2 of us, one-on-one. Are you sure that's what you want? And then it's like, oh, no, I'll give it up. Good for you. I will not tolerate racist remarks made in my presence. I will not tolerate anti-Semitic remarks made in my presence. I will not tolerate sexist remarks made in my presence about my friends I'll tolerate them about me because I know I'm what most men cannot stand. I will not tolerate ageist remarks made in my presence anymore because I'm old. And old for me is an acronym for octogenarian, living dangerously.
In this conversation, I'm not sure what it tells us about how far we've come and how far we've yet to go.
When we elected Barack Obama, I remember Whoopi Goldberg saying, now I can put my suitcase down. I don't have to leave the country anymore. And I thought, oh my God, Whoopi, I don't have to do the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise anymore. Look at the progress that we've made. See, I didn't realize that the racists would go underground and with the help of Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd, which is what Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell represent to me. Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd. Have you ever seen the comic strips about Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd? Well, if you haven't, or even if you have, get some of those tapes and look at them. And you're going to see that those 2 puppets that Edgar Bergen brought out and sat on his lap, one on each knee, put his hand up their back, moved their mouths with his hand, and threw his voice into their mouths, so it sounded like they were talking. They are puppets being manipulated by somebody who is not intelligent enough to have had the job he had, and he is not intelligent enough to be elected to do that job again. We are on the verge of losing our democracy because people are willing to tolerate self-imposed ignorance instead of going for self-imposed education.
Absolutely. To kind of bring this conversation back full circle, back to our Jane Crow project, just like was true in the time that you were in the classroom, Jane, with your 3rd graders, a majority of the women, today 80%, but probably even more in 1968, majority of the teachers in the classrooms are white women. We're not going to be able to fix the inequity problems in the classroom, the race problems in the classrooms, unless white women, they do something. They stand up, they speak out, and they change the way that they're programmed. They change the way that they're operating in the classroom, and they act more like accomplices in education spaces and in the world. So for you, I have this one last question. What advice would you give to white women in classrooms today who want to be an accomplice, who want to change and be different, but who are afraid of the fallout?
Be sure your job's secure first. Get so good, particularly if you're K through 8. get so good at teaching reading that they wouldn't let you go. They will let you do anything if you just would keep on teaching reading. There aren't very many teachers who know how to teach a dyslexic child. And many of your boys, many of your little boys, many of your grown boys, many of your grown men are dyslexics. They do not hear words the way they're said, and they do not see words the way they're written. They are bad spellers because they do not see those letters in the proper order. In my class, they came into the classroom reading at the first grade level because the kindergarten, first, and second grade teachers didn't recognize what was going on with those kids. So I looked like, wow, what a teacher. I could undo what they had done, not because I was smarter than they were, but because I had taken a course in Orton Slingerland phonics, and I knew how to teach every child of whatever age to read. Every educator, and the word educator means to lead people out of ignorance, a person who is engaged in leading people out of ignorance. I'm not a teacher, I'm an educator. If you don't know how to teach the dyslexic child, you don't know how to teach at least a third of the students in your classroom. From 20 to 30% of all of our students are dyslexic and moderately to severely dyslexic. Racism does work, and we keep on doing it because it does work. You know it works, I know it works, and denying that it's there will not change the situation. It works. We know how to keep people in their place. Read Whitney Young's book, Beyond Racism. And if you don't believe any of this, read the book, The Myth of Race by Robert Wald Sussman. And then read Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. Did you know that 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, people in the Nile Valley were doing cataract surgery with metal instruments 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ? That's 6,000 years ago. For the love of God, how long will we continue to say those people of a different color aren't as smart as we are? They haven't faded as much as we have, so they must not be as bright as we are. Give me a break.
So to tell our people who want to be, our white women who want to be an accomplice, be the best teacher you can possibly be so good that they can't fire you.
Give up the word white. Take on the word melanemic. Melanemic means being melanin challenged. The light brown kids are melanaceous. The dark brown kids are melanotic. There's no negative characteristic to those three words. They are simply a description of the amount of melanin in your skin. And if you have to talk about race, use the word mosaic. A mosaic is an art form that is new, beautiful, and made of many elements. Instead of biracial or interracial, use mosaic.
Oh, I love it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is. Mosaic works. Mosaic works. And we are all mosaic. There's another thing you have to remember. We are all mosaic. If you are a human being, you are made of many elements.
Any other advice for the melanemic women who want to make a difference?
Stop telling women of color what you are willing to do for them. Don't ever say that again as long as you live. I will never forget the woman who said, 78, probably 70, 78-year-old woman, who said to a group of melanaceous women, "After all I've done for you." And I thought, oh shit, shut up. Shut up now. Finally, they all just looked at her. And then they looked at me and I went, and then they let her have it. They came down on her like ducks on a June bug. Who asked you to do for us? We didn't need you to do for us. You were doing for yourself. You were doing that to make yourself feel good. And you know it and we know it. Now don't do for us anymore. If you want to do with us, that's one thing, but you don't have to do for us anymore. And I didn't feel sorry for this woman. She's crying. And I'm sitting there thinking, you silly witch. All these years that you've been looking down on people and saying, look at how wonderful I am that I'm going to do this for you. They were thinking, you miserable person. If you and your husband would treat us fairly every day of our lives, you wouldn't have to look down on us and you wouldn't have to do anything for us and you would recognize how valuable we are. But that's not how we white women see women of color. Practically everything I know, I learned from women of color. And if you haven't read, she wrote the book, The ISIS Papers, Frances Cress Welsing. If you haven't read that book, white women, for God's sake and your own sake, get it and read it. And read The Myth of Race and realize that the man wanted to write The Lie of Race, but no one would buy it and no one would publish it if he wrote The Lie of Race. We women, if we melanemic women had joined the civil rights movement in huge numbers, when we decided to have the women's movement, all those melanaceous and melanotic women would have joined the women's movement. But you know, and I know, that the women's movement was a white women's movement, and white men let it happen because they wanted to destroy the civil rights movement. And if they let white women have their way, then that took away all the problems they were having with these black people. If white women had gone into the civil rights movement in huge numbers, they would have gotten what they need, and then we could have stepped forward and said, now it's our turn. But we don't even join the Black Lives Matter movement. We don't want to be identified with those women, even though they are our 30th to 50th cousins.
Mm-hmm. And that's the same reason why you hear people talk about the white feminism, the concept of white feminism, and why so many women of color are not interested in celebrating these things like suffrage or the different landmarks of women's rights, because it's all backed by white feminism, the same white feminism that walked away from the civil rights movement.
I have heard black women say to white women pushing white women's movement, don't talk to me about your white women's movement while your foot's on my husband's neck. We white women will allow ugly things to happen to black women, but we would like them to be in the women's movement as long as they didn't have any power, or as long as they didn't look black, because our association with them causes many of our husbands to be uncomfortable. But don't ask women of color to join the women's movement as long as it's all. You might as well be wearing signs that say black women need not apply.
Really, that's what they did during the suffrage movement, right?
Well, yeah, it was all about them. It was all about us, and for us, that meant people that look like me. And I've heard this out of people over and over and over. Well, if they get power, they're going to want to do to us what we've done to them. And yeah, this is what Mr. T. Rump says. We've got to keep those people from getting back to numerical majority. We don't want them to have a numerical majority in this country, and they're going to. There's no way you can avoid it. So you better start treating people of all colors fairly. Right now, they wonder if white Christians who say, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, are practicing what they preach. Are we white people doing unto people of color the way we want to be treated? I don't think we are. I don't think that we so-called white women are treating people of color the way we want to be treated.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today about your experiment and your experience, about your very full life. And I know I've asked you this before privately, but I often wondered if you knew that day would change the whole trajectory of your life.
No.
And I'm sure you did not.
No, I didn't. And it gets to be lonely, especially now that my support is gone. My husband is gone. And sometimes I think it would be nice to sit around with a group of women and just have a good female conversation. But the N word would come up, or something about biracial would come up, or something would come up about LGBTQ. And I would have to stand up and say, what the hell is the matter with your head? How much longer are you going to live with this self-imposed ignorance and blame it on somebody else's physical characteristics? My best friend here in Menifee said to me before she died, Jane, I don't want to talk to you. I don't like the things you talk about. And we've been best friends for 15 years. And I said, okay. So I didn't see her anymore because she didn't want to hear that there was anything wrong with the way we good Christians have behaved over the last 2,000 years, and certainly not over the last 10 years or 20 years or 30 years.
There's something that really is going to resonate with me from our conversation today, to offer the women, the educators that are sitting there thinking about how can I make a difference, and I'm afraid, and what can I do? In addition...
Wait a minute, tell them this. The only thing necessary for the perpetuation of evil is for good people to do nothing. They need to hear that over and over and over again, because as long as so-called white women will cooperate with that, that's how long we'll have that problem.
For me, I think, what resonates for me is if I thought to myself, if I were there, soul searching and thinking, well, what would motivate me? I'm going to be as good as I can at my job. I'm going to stop doing those things that melanemic women do. to the women they work with, and try to reprogram my brain and stop working over. And then I think the other piece of that is to be prepared, for the hard parts because what I hear from you is that when you committed to walk this path, Jane, you committed to this path 100%. Yeah. So where you are, no one gets away with saying something racist or sexist or ageist or ableist in your presence. And it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter if that relationship is something that you treasure. You live those values every single day and to whatever end may come. And that is just, that sits with me as something that's so special and so admirable, because so many times in the world, people just let it.
Wait a minute. I have a choice as to whether or not to do that.
You do.
Black women don't have that choice. Black women don't have that choice. Women don't have the right to say, I'm going to stand up for my son and for my daughter and my husband. They don't have that right. They don't have the right to say, I am what I am, and the first modern human beings look like me. And I want you to understand that, Whitey. They don't have that right. And their husbands don't have that right. And their husbands and fathers and sons have lost their lives trying to have the rights that white people think we are born with.
Right. And I think I look around and I see so many people just let things slide.
It's easier.
They just let it go. And they say, well, this person is important to me and I don't want to lose them. Or this is a member of my family and I don't want to create chaos at the dinner table. And they just let it go. And oftentimes I say to my friends and family, this is how we got here. People like us that look like us let too much go.
That's right.
We just let it go to make things comfortable for people, to make things, comfortable for ourselves, to preserve relationships without, we didn't want to poke the bear. We didn't want to, we just kind of nodded at it and said, there's only a couple of those people out there. But it turns out there's a lot more of those people than we thought.
If you want peace, die. But as long as you're alive, you will have some chaos. That's the way it is. You cannot grow without changing. There is no way. You have a 6-month-old child. You want that child to grow and to change. And as that child grows, that child changes every single day. If it doesn't change and doesn't grow, you've done something very wrong. And people say to me all the time, it was good enough for my father and it's good enough for me. And I say, BS. It wasn't good enough for your father. If it was good enough for your father, we wouldn't have fought the Civil War. And we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. And we never would have elected somebody who would build a wall along the southern border of the United States to keep brown-skinned people out.
I have so enjoyed talking to you today and all the other times we talked as well. And I appreciate you sitting down and taking the time to talk with me about all of this. Do you have any last words for our audience?
Yeah, I don't believe in pushing a book, but I've just started to reread this book that I wrote. Now, I wrote it as a diary to tell my kids why what was happening to them was happening to them. It's a terrible job of writing, but there's stuff in that book. I started to read it today and I thought, oh my God, if I just get this out into enough people's hands, I can stop working. Because there are things in that book that I thought at the time, I did at the time, I learned at the time, and if enough of us would read that, we wouldn't have to do what I'm doing. And we could educate ourselves out of this stupidity of racism.